So, Ken, so in your estimation, is there a reason why a male who's quote unquote identifying as a female needs to be transferred into a female prison for his own safety?
For his own safety, no. I don't think there's any reason for, I'm not going to say what's in my mind, John, but I don't think there's any reason for an intact inmate, an intact male inmate, to be transferred to a female institution. But a male inmate who is looking to be transferred into a female institution and he's still intact, that's a red flag for me. It's just a red flag.
So what I want the listeners or viewers to understand is we have less than 5% of the overall population are females in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. They have twice as many mental health issues, or those that are on the mental health roster. So a very small population has twice the mental health issues and twice the seriously mentally ill. And those are some of the more profound mental health diagnoses. So the difference between female population and male population couldn't be any more stark.
The culture that is being brought into the women's facilities from the men's institution is nothing like women are used to being around or are familiar with on any level. Women are not separated by crime level, security level, race, gang affiliation, anything like that. But the men's facilities are highly segregated like that for safety purposes. So when someone comes from a men's institution, they bring that type of politics into the women's environment.
In terms of the range of offenses and then the nature of their stability, who we're talking about, so also the vulnerability. Because if somebody's on the mental health roster, they are considered more vulnerable. So for women, they are twice as likely to be on the mental health roster as men.
This is a lot to deal with. I mean, Kelsey, this is why you decided to shine a light on this. And I understand in the first episode of this, you're going to show us a woman who had a cellmate who was actually a man claiming to be a female. And I cannot imagine the terror that such a woman feels every night going into her bunk.
Of the prisons in the U.S., nearly half. So we have 24 states with only one female prison. Of 24 states, all the men that are going to transition are going to go to one institution that houses all the state's female inmates.
So in particular, there was a convicted rapist, as I understand it, named Richard Masbruch, who identified as a trans woman, went by the name Sherry in a prison transfer. So tell us about your experience with that.
That's a particular incident or situation that I was incarcerated during the processing of that individual. The depression, the feelings of worthlessness and just being completely forgotten was extremely heavy within the institution at that point. This was a person who had been convicted of multiple rapes, and they were crimes that took place in the same county that the prison is in. So many women were familiar with the commission of the crime, and it was very it was debilitating emotionally on some level. And there was some electrocution that took place in the commission of that crime. And this individual walked directly up to the Women's Advisory Council president and asked if they could help them get a job in the electrical shop. So it's very brazen. This isn't a situation where people are just trying to assimilate and fit in. It's definitely a hostile takeover.
It's hard to imagine what this living space looks and feels like, but these women are in very tight quarters, and now with biological men where they are sharing bunk beds with these individuals. And I'll never forget, one line really stuck with me, that women are climbing up their bunk in their nightgown with a male sitting in bed beneath them, a fully intact male. They are sharing showers and toilets, very intimate facilities with biological men.
You previously gave me permission to speak bluntly, at the risk of potentially offending some of your viewers. And I may have mentioned this in our last segment, or touched on it. You take a guy who's going to be locked up for a number of years, sex offender or not, transfer him into a women's institution, and what the hell do you think is going to happen?
Amy, I know that you've been keeping this blog and getting feedback from incarcerated women now. IWF sent over a sample that reads as follows. I'll read it in part. I'm wide awake, nightmare from my childhood, 1 a.m. In my unit, blank just keeps getting accommodation after accommodation after 3 incidents with 3 different white women. The first one he choked. Second, he repeatedly punched her in the face. Then the nerve to pull his penis out and demand that she perform fellatio on him. Only the last victim was moved to C Yard pending an investigation. This woman has been having a rough time since. She's been put out from different rooms because she wakes up screaming from her nightmares triggered by this guy. The last victim's here for murder/domestic violence partner. She's been raped, beaten, etc. These women need help. So you've got a portion of women who are in there who do have domestic violence pasts that are traumatic. And now they're being forced to be housed with many men, some very high percentage of which, the number I saw was 33.8% of those who are housed, the males who are housed with females, are registered sex offenders. Over in Great Britain, they say it's nearly 75% of transgender prisoners in Britain are behind bars for sex offenses, per the Daily Mail.
And that's in comparison to the 17% approximately in the general male population. So this is a really increased number. And the fact that they're registered means that this is not a first offense as a sex crime. Many women are serving life sentences behind killing their attackers, their abusers. 90% of incarcerated women in California are battered and beaten, or have been battered and beaten, and now they're continuing to be battered and beaten. So the PTSD that everyone was recovering from is now morphing into complex PTSD, and the symptoms are being felt widespread. Women are, it's like this contagion at this point. They're encouraged to just put their heads down and get over it. If they seek mental health services, they're told, that they need to stop being transphobic. One woman,
my Lord.
Right. One woman was told that she had to have her session cut short because the mental health care provider was uncomfortable.
You've got to be
really
kidding
nowhere. And there's a very huge shortage of mental health clinicians within the prison system too. So there's no respite from this. They have no resources. There's no one to even talk to. And I can feel it through the phone calls on a daily basis, how desperate and limited they're starting to feel. It's like the walls are closing in on them.
This is a nightmare.
Ken, you worked in the prison system for a long time. I didn't work as long. My stint was a little over 11 years. We ended the last program with me asking you the question, can you think of any reason why a man should be transferred, a male inmate should be transferred in with female inmates? Your point was well taken. He said, well, from a guy's perspective, that's like just a wonderful opportunity, but from a woman's perspective, or as far as the safety of female inmates, you replied how?
I can't think of any good reason that a man should be transferred into a female institution. From the guy's point of view, I can think of a few. But generally speaking, I cannot think of any.
What about the housing of male inmates in female prisons, right, that are alleging they're transgender and they're manipulating the system to take advantage and take what they want? Something needs to drastically change in CDCR. Right now, you have male inmates housed in female prisons, and God knows what's happening in those walls and in those cells. I'm not talking about things in the past. I'm talking about what's happening now, and this is why I left. Some of them are in there for sex crimes. They were excited because California, the Department of Corrections gave them a perfect storm to be able to exploit their sexual predatorial behaviors. That's unethical, that's immoral, that's dangerous. The victimization of legitimate female inmates. And every time a female inmate will try to voice their complaints or their concerns for their victimizations, they will be retaliated against. I couldn't imagine being in a situation where nobody can hear you, right? Where everything you say is getting shut down. These are monsters. So you give them a green light and a pass to go into these women's facilities, they're chomping at the bits. And the role of a correctional officer, they're simply there opening and unlocking gates. They know it's not right. They know in their heart it's not right. They reach out to me. It doesn't sit well. See, their job is not to stop the individual from going into there. That he's already been approved through the proper chains to be able to let, the wolf go into the chicken's den.
Predator Watch finds a brief overview of important stories in the news or issues of concern as they relate to understanding the nature of sexual predators, their characteristics, how their minds operate, their methods of manipulation, and what motivates them. They hide in plain sight, can smell an opportunity a mile away, and count on people not understanding just how dark their hearts are and how intent they are about always producing victims. Stay tuned as Jon Uhler, a licensed professional counselor with over 25 years of professional experience treating both survivors and sexual predators, shares his insights on this edition of Predator Watch.
So between us, we have 35 years of collective experience on this podcast right now. So I would say that's probably pretty good. It's a pretty good perspective as far as field research and behind the scenes.
You introduced me as an expert. I am not even sure that I would consider myself a gifted amateur, John.
Well, I think you're being humble, because if anybody, talk about field experience, and what I have said time and time again is we have quote unquote academic experts, but where do those people work? They tend to work in the halls of academia. They will try to gain access. That's a lengthy process to come into an institution for a couple of hours or a couple of days. They will take their information back, typically after interviewing inmates, and they'll take that back, and now they can write a definitive report or definitive research report that has now insightful findings. I'm not suggesting that somebody can't derive good information, but what I have said on a number of occasions is that those that, if you really want to be able to understand the minds and the characters and characteristics of those that are behind bars, to come in for an hour or two or three or a couple of days, you're never gonna get at that, right? You have to be able to work with them in an embedded situation. That becomes what amounts to field research, almost like the Jane Goodall had to go live with live with her subjects. So that's why I consider you are an expert, because 25 years behind bars, you know it.
I have a story for you there, John. Were we carpooling when I was taking master's classes?
As a matter of fact, we were, and I should mention to people that is also how we know one another. We not only worked at my last institution for a couple of years, but if you want to get to know somebody, carpool with them. And so Ken and I were carpool partners there for a couple of years. So yes, you had taken masters. You were starting to take some of those courses.
Did I tell you that I had walked over to the criminology building and spoke with a professor over there?
Remind me.
She told me that she had been doing research with inmates and was questioning them. She had them filling out questionnaires, which, you know, a lot of researchers do. And the inmates just love to fill out questionnaires, get to play with the pencil and write all sorts of interesting responses to the questions, chuckle to themselves while they do so. But there is no substitution for real-world experience.
We have the issue of men being transferred into women's prisons, and that's a very real issue now. It's generated a lot of interest, a lot of concern online. So I thought, who better to deal with the subject than two men that spent a lot of time in prison, but in a professional capacity in their own right. And I should mention to people that is also how we know one another. We not only worked at my last institution for a couple of years, but if you want to get to know somebody, carpool with them. And so Ken and I were carpool partners there for a couple of years. And we dealt with trans inmates. I had one in my long-term program at the first institution. And then there was starting to become more of, I don't want to say an influx, because that, a couple of them were an influx, but around about 2014 to 2015 is when I noticed on psych staff, because all of them ended up on the special needs unit, and they ended up, or I shouldn't say all of them, but a number of them ended up in the special needs unit, and therefore psychology kind of followed them. And a number of them were placed on my roster, my caseload, because, and I found this interesting, because I was one of the psych staff that would treat them with respect. And maybe also because they didn't want to, I don't know. That's interesting to think why they ended up on my caseload.
But John, I thought you were phobic. I haven't seen you to be phobic in any manner. You are a person with very strongly held beliefs. A little crazy. But nobody gets out of the Department of Corrections with their sanity completely intact. Nobody works for as long as you have with both sex offenders and victims without having their sanity somewhat tested. So, yeah, I would simply say you have some very strongly held beliefs. And you may be a little crazy, but not in a bad way. I have always seen you use your insanity, that little bit of craziness you have, for good purposes. Nobody works for as long as you have with both sex offenders and victims without having their sanity somewhat tested.
Well, I appreciate that. Okay, that's good. That's good feedback. Okay, now we'll get into some of the content that's very germane to this, because again, right now we have nationwide men that are being placed in women's prisons. So that is a huge concern. What are your thoughts? You saw them come in. Let's now talk kind of off the cuff. Everything from, do you think that there's a need to transfer them to a women's prison? Because do you think they are at risk? Because what the general public is being told is these very sensitive, frail men in drag are easy target for exploitation. They're just going to get harmed in the male prison, and therefore we have to make sure that they're protected. So under the guise of that, we're going to send them to do their time. A man, we're going to send him over to a female prison, and we just found out that one of them had a wonderful time with And the question is, how many other women did he rape? Okay. And that's against the rules in the Department of Corrections. You can't, whether same gender or not, you can't do that.
No.
A lot more just sexual harassment, sexual assaults, a lot of stuff we didn't experience at the frequency that we started experiencing when they started transferring men into the prisons.
So share with us. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
They live in the houses with us. Just wanted to clarify that. So they live there and there are no guards. There are no cameras. So they're able to do whatever they want within those 2 hours between the guards coming.
So the male transferees are living with you in these, for lack of a better phrase, cottage-style prison residences where they're checked upon every 2 hours, and there are large gaps where things happen, as it would normally, but apparently there's a more exacerbated situation because the men who came in are causing more issues?
Yeah, well, like you mentioned at the beginning of the show, 44% of males who identify as women in federal custody are sex offenders. 86% are in for violent crimes, and 94% of them actually committed their crimes while still living as men. And once they were charged, they started identifying as a woman.
So I'm going to ask the million-dollar question. Why? Why do these prisoners start identifying as women?
So if they identify as women, they apply for transfers to women's prisons, and now they are near their victim. And what a lot of people don't know is that in women's prisons, we actually have a mother-child program. So our children 4 years and under can live with us full time. So not only would they get access to women, they would get access to children. So it's actually the perfect setup for those that have sex crimes or violence against women and children.
In your estimation, is there any good reason why a male inmate should be transferred to a female institution?
Good for the male inmate or good in general? Because if you're talking good for the male inmate, if he's going to be locked up for a period of time and he wants to have sex, I'm sure he would prefer to have a large population of women to have sex with rather than a large population of men. But generally speaking, I can't come up with any good reason. I can come up with a number of reasons it shouldn't happen, but I can't come up with a single reason it should.
2 female inmates are pregnant after they had sex with another inmate at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Clinton. That's the Department of Corrections. Last year, Edna Mahan began housing transgender inmates who identify as female. That's after a lawsuit filed by a trans woman who was forced to live in men's prisons. The DOC would not provide details on what actions they took in response to the pregnancies, but says they're taking measures to ensure the health and the safety of all inmates there.
You take a guy who's going to be locked up for a number of years, sex offender or not, transfer him into a women's institution, and what the hell do you think is going to happen?
Thank you, Kevin. A controversial court ruling tonight. A convicted criminal who served time at the women's prison in Chowchilla is charged with raping fellow inmates. A Madera County judge says Tremaine Carroll must be referred to with she, her pronouns. But the district attorney is pushing back because the 52-year-old Carroll is a biological male, and the decision could impact the pursuit of justice. Court records show Carroll was convicted in Los Angeles County in 1993 for aggravated kidnapping for the purpose of ransom or to commit another crime. Carroll is now serving time in a men's prison as this rape case moves forward.
Action News reporter Brianna Willis spoke with the district attorney about the potential impact of the pronoun ruling.
A Madera County judge ruled this week 52-year-old state prisoner Tremaine Carroll must be referred to with she, her pronouns because Carroll identifies as a woman. But the district attorney believes the defendant is abusing the system.
This is a person who's not a woman in any sense of the word.
In March, DA Sally Moreno charged Carol for rape allegedly committed while incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla.
After his first cellmate became pregnant and was moved to Los Angeles, two other cellmates of his complained that he had raped them. So we have filed rape charges against this inmate.
Moreno says the ruling regarding pronouns impacts her ability to prosecute the case.
This is a particular issue in this case because it's confusing to the jury. In California, rape is a crime that has to be accomplished by a man.
Supervising Deputy DA Eric Dutemple says it's also unfair to the victims.
It's just absolutely insane that a victim would have to get on the stand and police their pronouns and their usage when trying to recite one of the most scariest times in their lives.
Carol was allowed to serve time in a women's prison despite being a biological male because of Senate Bill 132, the Transgender Respect Agency and Dignity Act, which took effect in 2021. It allows inmates to be housed with the gender they identify as. The CDCR website points out state law prohibits discrimination based on gender identity.
There's no psychological evaluation that needs to be done. This person doesn't need to be on cross-gender hormones. They don't need to be signed up for transgender surgery. They don't even need a significant psychological evaluation regarding gender confusion. The mere statement is enough.
The CDCR has since relocated Carol to Salinas Valley State Prison for men. We reached out to CDCR about the case. They sent us a statement about Senate Bill 132, adding that they thoroughly investigate all allegations of sexual abuse, but they do not comment on cases in current litigation. Moreno says Carol fired the defense attorney handling the case and has chosen to move forward with self-representation in court. Carol's next court date is set for January 14th. Brianna Willis, ABC 30 Action News.
A male inmate who is looking to be transferred into a female institution and he's still intact, that's a red flag for me. It's just a red flag.
California has passed legislation allowing transgender inmates in the state's correctional facilities to be assigned housing based on their gender identity.
So my name is Jennifer, and I'm formerly incarcerated. I did 15 years on a 22-year sentence. Growing up, I suppressed a lot of anger. There was some sexual trauma going on as an adolescent. And so I just took to doing drugs, and I took to the streets, which the gang lifestyle embraced me. So I found like a sense of home there. And one thing led to another, and I was incarcerated for attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and gang enhancements. I was incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. I would get up early in the morning, read my Bible. Now I would go to work at the dental lab, and I was a full-time employee there. And then I went to college at night. The transgender inmates started coming, I want to say during COVID. They were just slowly being incorporated into general population. We're getting the predators, people who have been incarcerated for rape, men who have been incarcerated for oral copulation, men who have been incarcerated for crimes against women. We were very nervous, angry. We weren't given a voice.
Women's safety is paramount, especially in prison. You know, I am someone who has had experience working in the past with incarcerated sex offenders, and they are not the most trustworthy group, needless to say. So I'm not frankly surprised if you have incarcerated sex offenders claiming to identify as female in order to get access potentially to further victims, which we have seen. The fact that, that there are these male offenders who identify as female while in prison, who go back to identifying as male once they are released into the community, speaks to the fact that there's something not right here.
In my experience, and in my opinion, and I feel that it's unfortunate, John, I feel I need to say that prior to every statement, because there may be those out there who would want to clip and cut certain things out of these podcasts to fit their agenda and make it look like we're saying things we did not say. But I can't think of any good reason that a man should be transferred into a female institution. From the guy's point of view, I can think of a few. But generally speaking, I cannot think of any.
I'm kind of a tough girl, so I know I could stand my ground. But living in such close quarters with someone of the opposite sex, when we have a shower and the toilet is in the same room and the door is locked at night, it's a little intimidating, not knowing what to expect. But it would be nice to be included in such a drastic change that was happening in the women's facility at the time. Ava Reeves. We came home from work and she was there. They moved one of our roommates out and moved Ava in. Ava's very tall and has had physical altercations with women. Immediately, I went to our housing staff to voice my concern because Ava Reeves had a reputation that preceded her from a different yard. And we didn't want that type of person or activity in the room because we were all positive programming and trying to focus on getting home. The officers states their hands are tied if we're so uncomfortable with living with that individual that we could pack up and they would find us a new spot to live. And it seems like their rights overrode ours. If someone didn't want a transgender man in their room, they were asked to move and the transgender would have the room to themselves. And this room normally houses 8 women. So they were willing to move 7 women for 1 man. For us, we would love to have a room to ourselves because every day you're constantly around people. You have no peace of mind. There's no solitude in prison. So to be afforded a single cell, people would love to have that, but it was never afforded to the women. It was just to the men.
Well, I think one of the things that bothers me about it, Deborah, we had last week on the show, we had one of the survivors of the Rotherham grooming gangs on the show, Sammy Woodhouse. And it seems to me a little bit like that here in that it's the most vulnerable women. So, for example, you have women's shelters in your own country, in Canada. You have women's shelters that will admit men who identify as women. So you have women who go to the women's shelter to get away from predatory men, and they find out that quite opportunistically, men are identifying as women to get into the women's shelter. So often this burden seems to be falling, as in prison and as in the women's shelters, often on the most vulnerable women in society.
Absolutely. And what I find most frustrating is that the activists and the allies who are pushing for these policies and who are pushing for the emphasis on gender self-identification over biological sex, above really everything else, they are not the people who have to live with these decisions. They are not the ones who are going to be living in the shelters or in the prisons among these, in some cases, male rapists or male violent offenders and having to live day to day with fear and intimidation and having, in some cases, to be assaulted by them. And that's what I find most upsetting. You know, you talk about, this is not a problem that would have existed, I would say, even a couple decades ago. It really speaks to where we are in 2022 and the fact that these activists really have managed to intimidate so many people into going along with it.
So, Ken, so in your estimation, is there a reason why a male who's quote unquote identifying as a female needs to be transferred into a female prison for his own safety?
For his own safety, no.
One of our housing staff who was willing to try and make things work because she knew it was uncomfortable and she didn't agree, but she stated that she couldn't speak up against the situation because of all the lawyers that were involved for the transgender men, and she wasn't willing to risk her job for us. But she did make some moves, so eventually a week later, Ava Reeves was able to move to a different room in the same unit. When the transgender men came over, it's like the women's rights were eliminated and it became about the transgender rights. For example, we used to have a women's advisory council, and once the transgender men came, they changed the name to Inmate Advisory Council. Prior to me being released, we started being referred to as incarcerated people. We're clearly getting the message that we as women don't have any rights and that we don't matter. SB 132 might have been geared for people on the free world, but once you put institution in place, it becomes something different. It becomes a catch-22 for the manipulators in the men's institution to seek refuge somewhere else. The majority of men who came from the men's facility into the women's facility all now have girlfriends, and they all live with them. There is one man who came and he wore pigtails and lipstick and pink shirts for the first 3 months. And after that, he cut his hair short, almost bald, and started wearing Levi's and white t-shirts to resemble a man again. Got a girlfriend, lived with her, and there was domestic violence there. Women who have been through trauma, women who have been through domestic violence situations are at risk again. They've already suffered, committed their crime, and are trying to find healing, but now the healing is gone because now you have men in the institution and they have to start that process from square one.
Many people think that once these individuals are locked up, they are no longer a threat. Well, they're no longer a threat to general population. They're no longer a threat to outside society, but they are still a threat even inside the walls to the other people who are inside the walls.
We begin at 6 with that horrifying crime inside the already troubled Oklahoma County Detention Center. And a warning before we go any further, these allegations are disturbing.
Here's what happened. A female inmate handcuffed to a wall awaiting her release is raped by an unsupervised male inmate. The suspect, Dante Thomas, now faces charges in the July 19th attack. News 4's Nick Camper joins us now with the investigation. Nick?
It is disturbing indeed. Officers caught him in the act, but it took 2 months before the rape charges were filed, and authorities say he is now at large.
That woman's going to have to live with that for the rest of her life. The trauma that she's going to go through. She'll never be able to put her trust back into a government, a law enforcement system ever.
A woman was allegedly raped inside the Oklahoma County Detention Center. The suspect is Dante Thomas. The police report says he was left unattended after being processed, then walked down the hall to a medical cell. That is where he found a woman, her left hand cuffed to the wall. She was defenseless. The report says the jail video captured the entire incident. Video shows her shaking her head no and trying to resist. It took 5 minutes for an officer to spot the assault and place Thomas in handcuffs.
Thomas was in jail that night on assault and battery charges. He later bonded out and remains at large.
But a male inmate who is looking to be transferred into a female institution, and he's still intact, and that's a red flag for me. It's just a red flag.
Okay, people. Scotland's Justice Secretary has expressed faith in the Scottish Prison Service's decision to place a transgender woman convicted of raping 2 women while he was a man in a women's prison. It's, to be honest with you, quite difficult for me to say all of that, actually. Isla Bryson began his transition to become a woman after being found guilty of 2 rapes as a man. Currently being held in a segregated unit in Stirling Women's Prison, it will be up to officials which gendered prison he will be incarcerated at. With me now is Kelly J. Keane, founder of Standing for Women. Kelly, this is an absolute shocker. I quite literally struggle to say the words here, not because I've got any fear of misgendering anyone, just because apparently political correctness gets in the way of all this nonsense. So we have a man who raped 2 women and then transitioned into womanhood during a trial, who's now going to be in a woman's prison. Have I woken up and gone to hell?
Shocked. I'm telling you, I'm absolutely shocked that somebody convicted of 2 violent, grotesque rapes would then call themselves a woman to try and get into a women's prison. I mean, it's hilarious because it's preposterous, but actually for those women in those prisons, it must be scary as hell.
Do you think that right at the core of this, there is something that thinks that, well, female convicts don't have rights?
I think there must be somewhat some of that attitude to women who end up in prison. I don't think we do care about prisoners very much at all. Most of us would like to see prisoners rehabilitated and coming back into society as better citizens than when they went into prison. I don't think that actually is what prisons achieve in this country. I think they're overcrowded, they're underfunded, and often they're a little bit too weirdly easy in bizarre ways, but they don't seem to do the job. But they're certainly not doing the job when you allow someone. I mean, any man in a woman's prison, as far as I'm concerned, is an absolute no. I don't care what they've done. You're born male, you commit a crime, you go into a man's prison, end of story. However, to then sort of do it in the first place is grotesque, but to send someone convicted of crimes, violent sexual crimes against women, and, just for a pink handbag, a bag coat and a terrible wig, he can now go into a women's prison. It's preposterous.
But it is literally that, though, isn't it? It's a wig on, it's a frock, and it's a handbag, and a change of name from the original, which is Adam Graham, which I think is probably the name that I'm certainly going to continue to use.
From my numerous trainings running batterers programs, I availed myself of every training which I could find and I could get to on the subject, because that is a complicated subject, working with men who batter their partners. I went through a training with our local women's shelter, 40 hours, once a week. I forget how long, several hours, once a week, twice a week twice a week. For a number of weeks. And the number of women in our prison system, I was shocked, who were in abusive relationships is extremely high. Quite a few of the women who are incarcerated for assault were in abusive relationships. They may not all have been incarcerated or prosecuted for assaulting their batterer, but a number of them were.
It is cruel and unusual punishment to subject them to this. This is totally unfair, and it's unsafe, as so many of these issues are involving men claiming that they're women wanting access to our spaces. There was just an article just days ago by the Daily Signal reporting on someone named Caitlin McGraw, a prisoner currently incarcerated in Wisconsin, serving a sentence for possession of narcotic drugs and bail jumping. She's been there since summer of 2023, and she was forced to room in a small prison cell with a transgender prisoner whose name reportedly is Mark Campbell. And she says, according to the Daily Signal, that in September, she had to file a report in September, she learned that this man raped his own daughter, that he's a registered sex offender, convicted of first-degree sexual assault of a child. And now this man is, according to the report, constantly masturbating and making sexual comments and aggressive behavior toward her. And she's got to share a tiny cell with him.
Trauma is a huge thing these days. Trauma-based therapy, looking at trauma in therapy. When you are getting to these women who were in abusive relationships and the trauma that they have suffered and how it has impacted their mental health, and then you take a man, particularly an intact male, and I don't think anybody has any confusion understanding what I'm talking about there, and drop him into a women's institution, what are you going to be triggering? You mentioned in the last segment that 66% of the women in the Pennsylvania DOC are on the mental health roster in some form or another. I think you would see that number increasing a lot. I think you would see the number of women who were seriously mentally ill increasing a lot if they were running into intact males in their institution.
The state of California and the California state legislature who passed this bill, they might be idiots, but they're not stupid. They know the consequences of this behavior. And you know how I know that they know the consequences even though they're such morons? Because the California prison system has been handing out condoms and Plan B contraceptives to female inmates in these prisons. What does that tell you? It tells you that these women know they expect to be raped. The prisons expect them to be raped. Remember, it doesn't matter the situation. All sex in prison is considered under the law to be non-consensual. But this is the reality of what happens when the left tries to destroy objective reality. People get hurt. This is not a language game. This is not a rhetorical trick. This is not respecting how their lived experience and how they're feeling. There are women in prison who have no recourse for themselves. They have no right to get a firearm. They can't move away. They can't even run away. They are in prison, in a cell, locked up with men who could have been convicted of domestic violence. These men could have been convicted of rape, for all we know. They have no way to escape and are going to be subject to the most heinous crime I can think of. There's one inmate, by the way, at this prison. Her name is Amber Jackson, and she was talking about this to the Santa Monica Observer, and this is what she said. She's like, call yourself a woman all you want, but when you have a man with a penis that works as if it was designed to do, that is a problem in a women's prison group shower room. That's a problem. She's right. It's more than a problem. This is a violation of these women. It's a violation of these women's fundamental rights.
Transfer him into a women's institution, and what the hell do you think is going to happen?
LA County DA's office has filed charges against the person accused of indecent exposure in a women's locker room at a Los Angeles spa. You may remember the incident back in June touched off protests outside the We Spa in Koreatown over transgender rights. Police identified the person involved as 52-year-old Darren Morager of Riverside County. Morager, who has been a registered sex offender since 2006, now faces 5 felony counts of indecent exposure. Morager, who claims to identify as a female, also faces charges from another locker room incident in 2018 and has a long criminal history.
And you mentioned the We Spa. The We Spa is the tip of the iceberg. a man going into the wee spa and exposing himself is the tip of the iceberg. We have 300 male inmates that are going to be moved to the female estate under the direction of Scott Wiener and the approval of Gavin Newsom. Many of these women have written to us, written to the Women's Liberation Front, saying, I'm scared. There's men with penises, many of them are sex offenders, who are going to be housed with us. Why are you doing this? Please don't. I mean, handwritten letter after handwritten letter after handwritten letter. So the wee spa, I understand, it's a good example of what's happening. But, you know, we're talking about prisons, we're talking about rape shelters, we're talking about where women are trying to exit prostitution. They need exit strategies. They need to be in a women-only environment most of the time. Or maybe they just feel more comfortable with it. And can you imagine if wee spa man was bunking with you in jail and you're a woman? I mean, I didn't know that we torture. I didn't know that in California you were being sent to Guantanamo Bay to be, you know, humiliated and, you know, subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. It's so horrifying. And this is the whole idea about it being top down. This is not a grassroots movement, right? This is something which is top down.
Alex, I want to reemphasize what you just said, because I can speak definitively, having worked on psychology staff for 11 years in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, having run one of the state's two at that time, high-intensity sex offender treatment unit, and I've done sex offender treatment for years. I'm a certified sex offender treatment provider. I can assure you that 100% of the men that are going to be transitioning, asking to be sent to a male prison, I can guarantee you 100%. If somebody wants to debate me, come on. And let's look at the files. I've looked at the files. I'll say 99%. I'm going to say 100% are sex offenders, and sex offenders of a violent kind, the kind that we think that the PR spin out in the public is trying to say, no, these are sensitive men that need to be protected. No, every individual that works in or lives in a prison knows that those guys that are transvestites that like male clientele, shall we say, male companionship, want to remain in the male prison. Okay, deviant men have no problem, and now you've given them the keys to years worth of hunting a captive audience. If I, as a sex offender, this is how their minds work. If I, as a deviant man who likes to traumatize women, if all I have to do, if I'm in for 5 years or even less, doesn't matter. If I know that you, Mr. and Mrs. State of California prison system, if I know you're going to open the door for an entire prison of women for me, and all I have to do is say the magic word that I'm trans, give me a form, I'm signing. Why? Mm-hmm. Because now you're going to put me in a prison loaded with females, and I'm going to have a heyday. And I'm going to rape, and I'm going to just have a ton of fun. Plus, as you indicated, I may be connected with pimps in an organized fashion, and now I work it with prison administrators. This is not too far-fetched. I'm going to go and make sure my property remains my property. I'm going to be placed in the exact same prison as my former property that, as you said, they're trying to escape prostitution, and I'm going to remind them, see, I told you, wherever you run, nowhere to hide, we'll find you. You might as well give it up. And when you get out, here's your home plan, here's the address, and it's back with the pimp you go.
Nikki, street name Green Eyes, ran from the program 2 months ago. Because she went back to using crack, Nikki hasn't slept for days. Nikki first got into Fresh Start when she was arrested in 2007.
I needed a fresh start. Basically, I needed a start, period. I never had much of a start at life before I used drugs, before I started prostitution, for anything. The prostitution for me wasn't that big of a deal because I've been I've been molested since I was real little, and I've been used a whole lot growing up, and nothing was ever done about it, so I was kind of already in that trap.
And by the way, in prison, just for everyone's information, there's no such thing as consensual sex in prison. Every sexual activity is considered non-consensual in prison. The state of California and the California state legislature who passed this bill, they might be idiots, but they're not stupid. They know the consequences of this behavior.
Meaning it would traumatize them.
It would re-traumatize them. They would be they would be revisiting some of the things that they had suffered previously.
So this is what the Women's Liberation Front actually reported about the incident. They said, we've now heard from 7 different people inside the prison that at least one woman, possibly more, is now pregnant after being housed with a male felon who was transferred to the women's prison under SB 132. So SB 132 is the law that passed in California last year that allows men who identify as women to be housed in a prison in accordance with their so-called gender identity. 300 males, or by the way, this law went into effect just this past January. 300 males since then in the California prison system have requested transfer, and 20 males have been processed thus far. That means 20 males are now on the loose in women's prisons. 20 males who, clearly some of which have male anatomy, working anatomy, and just say they identify as women. So this is a key thing too. This is identity only. So this law does not require surgery. It does not require a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It is based solely on the inmate saying, hey, now I'm a woman. I want to go live with the women. That's literally all it takes. And these men will be transferred to female prisons.
So Ken, so in your estimation, is there a reason why a male who's quote unquote identifying as a female needs to be transferred into a female prison for his own safety?
For his own safety? No. These men in the newer style of institution that's being built in Pennsylvania, and I would imagine throughout the United States, they're much, much safer than the old institutions. There's more line of sight. There are fewer corners and places to hide. There are more rounds being taken and made throughout the housing units. It's just, people will find trouble anywhere they want to. People will find problems anywhere they want to. Men and women who are incarcerated will find sex anywhere they want to. I don't know what the statistics are these days on rapes inside an institution, but there have been a lot of steps taken to reduce that number. I don't think it will ever be zero.
Yeah, that's right. There's a big push nationwide. It's called the Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA. And that is a major thing that all prison systems have to take very seriously.
And that started when we were both still working in the PADOC. It was pushed even harder after you left. It's never gone away, and it never will.
Ken, let me ask this question. I'm going to make a statement, then you give me whatever response you want. It's my contention, based upon, let's say, the newer prisons, but again, they're constructing prisons, and they're still adapting and adopting pre-existing ones that may be older. So when we talk about a newer prison, we're talking about the actual architecture of each of the the cell blocks, or what are called housing units, at least in the PADOC, where they have done enough research into what allows for or increases safety. And so if an officer sitting in the bubble or the desk can look out look at a glance, see every single cell. So each one is sort of angled that comes to a point at the furthest point. So it's no longer these long cells or corridors that you can't see down, but now in the modern ones, you can see whoever is at anybody's door.
Correct. You can see the doors. Can't see inside the cells unless they're directly across from the desk. But there are 2 windows in each cell, and one of the reasons that was given that our sergeant was murdered in the institution was because the inmate was blocking the line of sight in his cell with a towel, and the officer opened the door and took the towel down, which is the way it's supposed to be done. There's to be no object that impedes the line of sight into the cell. So if the officer walks past, looks in, he's to be able to see the entire cell. And that is for the safety of both inmates. If there's an inmate hanging in there, the officer needs to see that so that he can access the cell and cut the inmate down. If there is somebody being assaulted in there, or somebody who's in there and there's blood or some other sign that something has occurred, the officer needs to be able to see that.
So in the prison system then, at least in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, again, I'm going to assume these policies now are pretty much across the states, that in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, what I saw, especially there were a number of trans inmates, probably 3 or 4 that came into our particular institution, again, where we work. And I never heard anything from them that they were feeling threatened, that they felt they were in danger. As a matter of fact, a couple of them were very flamboyant, very interesting, but they get special privileges. There's no other way to put that. They can be single-celled, and so they get a cell by themselves. They're in a cell block. In our case, it was a special needs unit. They were really, if anything, they were very protected. And so the premise that these guys are threatened because they're sensitive and therefore they need to be moved for protection's sake to a female institution, respond to that.
In my experience and in my opinion, and I feel that it's unfortunate, John. I feel I need to say that prior to every statement, because there may be those out there who would want to clip and cut certain things out of these podcasts to fit their agenda and make it look like we're saying things we did not say. But in my opinion and in my experience, generally speaking, these inmates are not getting any attention that they do not wish to get. There was one who had rather large implants, and I don't know if this was during your time or after, who used to like to push them up against the window of the cell during count.
Which means everybody on the block can see the imprint.
Everybody with a direct line of sight to the cell, but mostly it was directed at the officer who was counting. And I believe this was the same inmate, used to taunt female staff who had smaller breasts than he did. And I believe this may be the same one who was counseled several times for not wearing a bra with a white T-shirt while going to yard, was turned away from yard several times for trying to go out to yard wearing a white T-shirt with no bra. Yes, in a male institution, bras were available at commissary, as I believe were, don't quote me on this because I don't know for certain, female panties, various, I do know that various hair products were available, as well as hair ties and things of that nature. I am not certain what else for females could be purchased at commissary. Now, there was another female, another trans inmate. I don't believe he had implants, but he was living as a female. And you and I spoke briefly before the podcast, and you also remembered this particular inmate. Very quiet, did not seem to want attention. So we've got two sides of the spectrum here. The very flamboyant, very outgoing, very attention-seeking, and then the other one who was very quiet. I had him in group. He may have spoken up only a few times, and only when I called on him to try to get him to participate. But wanted no attention. And then, of course, there is all the different middle inmates as well. I don't think there's any reason for, I'm not going to say what's in my mind, John, but I don't think there's any reason for an intact inmate, an intact male inmate, to be transferred to a female institution.
In California, since the implementation of self-ID, there has been a 30% increase in incarcerated people identifying as trans. There have been nearly 300 transfer requests, and a third of those transfer requests are from registered sex offenders. The Bureau of Prisons reports that 48% of trans-identified federal inmates are sex offenders. Something else worth taking into account is that biological males IDing as trans are classified at the high security level at 3 times the rate of the general population of federal inmates.
Why are we still here?
I gotta tell ya, I'm someone who is not good at maths, and even I know this is bad. Like, really, really bad. It really appears that these laws do not disqualify people who might be a threat to women. And honestly, that is really troubling. Especially if you consider the words of Michelle Norsworthy, who we discussed earlier. A handful of women who find themselves housed with these people have finally spoken up, saying that they're being traumatized and they're terrified. We feel like we're part of some sick joke. This is a nightmare that we can't wake up from. The women here are traumatized over and over again, and it seems as if no one cares about our needs. We feel like second-class citizens with no rights. The women even note that if they use the wrong pronouns or speak out of school, they are punished by the prison guards. The moment I found out that trans-identified males were coming to Edna Mahan, along with discovering that they were still equipped with their manhoods, that truly did something to me psychologically.
They just took these behemoths and they just threw them into their cells and said, deal with it. And then every time a girl does come out and say, I'm being harassed, or I'm being stalked, or I feel like I'm being gawked, they're just ignored. And that's not what PREA says. PREA says that once a report is made for sexual harassment, sexual assault, or any form of sexual abuse, you must respond. That's what correctional officers are supposed to do. They don't. Women have no say at all. And you know what? And I'm small compared to most of the fucking dudes that just showed up there. Some of them are like 260, 280 pounds, and I'm not talking fat. I'm talking 6'6", 6'7". Now imagine 10 of them walking in all of a sudden into a facility full of females who have been just running amok with each other all their lives, and all of a sudden now they don't have a prison anymore. And now when they try to ask for help, trans people got a lot more rights than they do.
Something that I want to note is that the vast majority of female inmates are not incarcerated for violent crime. In addition, a portion of that female population has been subject to sexual abuse and other kinds of violence in their life in the past. So bear that in mind when you hear the stories of the people with which they are now being housed.
But it's interesting that that's probably, my guess is, from my experience, Ken, it wasn't the actual trans inmates. when they came in, those weren't the ones that would ever ask for a transfer into a female institution. And so now we're looking at, or the question is, what's the nature of the kind of male inmates that would ask for or request a transfer in? And if on paper it looks like, or at least what the public is being told, that only about half are sex offenders, is it possible that a man has had charges for sexual assault in reality, but was never convicted because he took a plea deal? So in reality, he's a threat to women. He wants into a woman's prison, but on paper, people will say, well, he's not a sex offender. He's never been convicted of a sex-related offense. I have one guy that was just transferred in. So on paper, it's second-degree assault. But he's in sex offender treatment in lieu of being on the registry. So if he completes sex offender treatment, he won't have to be on the registry.
I have dealt with inmates who had prior sex offenses, currently in for a non-sex offense. Does that mean they are no longer a threat because their sex offense was a prior? Should they then be considered less of a threat to women? I don't know, John. I don't know about that one.
My body chemistry and physical shape is changing.
Back in June of 1999, David Warfield was an award-winning teacher who was leaving for summer break to make the biggest transition of his life. He returned in the fall as a woman, Dana Rivers, only to be placed on paid leave because he told some of his students about his sex change.
Ms. Rivers was given specific instructions as to not to discuss this information with students. This was violated. The conduct is at issue here, not her transgender orientation.
The district is paying me not to work. How logical is that?
Dana Rivers' plight was all over the airwaves. Students rallied behind her, and school board meetings became heated. Rivers said at the time, all she wanted to do was teach.
I'm a teacher by trade. Teaching is a calling. I'm passionate about my career and about working with young people.
She ultimately resigned from Center High School, sued the district, settled for $150,000, and moved to the Bay Area, where she continued as an activist for transgender issues. She fell off the radar until last week, when police spotted her coming out of the burning home where they found bodies of two women. Police believe Rivers set the home on fire to hide the bodies. The couple's adopted son was found in the driveway. Police said Rivers was covered in blood and they found ammunition in her pockets, but haven't offered any kind of motive for the triple murder.
Police were called to the 9400 block of Dunbar Drive, Oakland at 12:21 a.m. on November the 11th, 2016, after reports of gunshots in the area. When they arrived on the scene, they discovered Benny lying in the street outside his home. He had been beaten and shot, but was still alive. They performed CPR, but sadly he died. The house was on fire. After Oakland fire units responded and were able to put out the fire, police entered and found Patricia Wright and Charlotte Reed inside. They'd been beaten, shot and stabbed several times. Again, fire service staff had attempted to offer aid to the two women, but they also succumbed to their injuries. While attending to Benny, police had heard a loud bang from the garage. They subsequently saw Dana Rivers walking out of the home. He was covered in blood and was in possession of knives, ammunition and knuckle dusters. He was detained at the scene after attempting to flee using Charlotte's motorbike. Initial reports missexed Rivers by calling him a female. In subsequent reports, he has been referred to as a transgender woman. Given that he hit national headlines with the difficulties he had at the Center High School, it would have been very difficult to consign this person's trans identity to the media memory hole. Rivers was charged with murder and arson. He's been in custody on remand ever since, and to date his trial has still not started. He faces the death penalty if found guilty. He has pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. There's been very little media interest in the crime, which is surprising given its brutal nature. However, Kara Dansky has been maintaining updates on the progress of the legal proceedings. She's a public speaker, writer and consultant, the author of the book The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls, and she currently serves as president of the US chapter of Women's Declaration International.
People should know that this level of hatred, and somebody brought this up about, hatred, is that whatever went on, and we may never know exactly what it was that went on that caused him to stab Charlotte in the face. It's 47 times. Those are not the only stab wounds that she got. All around the face, the head, 47 times, while the other partner, Patricia, was not brutalized like that. Yes, she was murdered right there, right next to her partner. But something, as Dana said himself, it was personal. So, yeah, the details of why, though, people want to keep saying, did they bring up what the reason was for all three people? If you're going to go and you're going to take somebody out in their home late at night, knowing that they have a child and a partner, this guy, think about it. He was known as Mountain Man. This is a guy who was a river rafting instructor just 16 years before doing this crime. Okay, this is not somebody who was a weakling. The man that I saw in the courtroom, who is now, 67 years old, and of course he's been in prison. I don't know how when he went right in, but I mean, his body has changed for sure. But the level of, I cannot overstate, I mentioned in the article that myself, and I was sitting with a friend, Renee, and I thought it was just happening between he and I, and then I saw his eyes shift, but I locked eyes with him, and it was like, I know what I'm thinking when I'm looking at it, and he's looking right at me, and then I saw his eyes shift to him to the right a little, and he was looking right at my friend, and the three of us, for a good solid 20 seconds, were just like having a competition, like death stare. And when it stopped, my friend and I, our hands just touched, like, was that horrible or what?
And imagine when this one gets off the bus, goes through receiving, and there's female staff, and they're going to strip this individual out, and they're going to get off, and these women have to go home and feel totally violated and disgusting after work. And then the other women that are in the cage have to get naked with this person. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we don't matter. We just don't matter in the whole spectrum of the carceral, the legal, everything. They're systematically just erasing us and prioritizing these people's feelings. This small, teeny sector of mentally unwell, aggressive, attention-seeking individuals, their priority over our well-being and physical safety and mental health. It's freaking nuts.
Amy, can you talk about conditions in what were formerly women's prisons? Do you have some stats on how many rapes have been reported? And also, I read, I think on the Wolf website, that they are now placing condoms in the bathrooms because they're expecting these men are going to be, sexual with the women.
Well, the condoms are legally supposed to be in every institution, but since there's no penises in the women's prison, it's never been an issue. CCWF allegedly only has them for when women have family visits. CIW, on the other hand, in Corona, did place condom dispensers in the Medline. They were almost immediately removed. There's a staff memo that came out and said they were removed at the order of someone higher than the warden. I think it was too controversial. I have the memo stating that there's, yes, condom dispensers. But what this immediately sent out was a wave of panic because the women understand they don't have penises. None of them have penises. People, and in their head, oh, trans women are transferring in. These are people who are post-op. They're thinking, it's very confusing. So you automatically go to, so they're telling them to rape safe, right? It was like the most heartbreaking thing for my friends to call and say, they're just telling them, they're giving them the green light to just rape us. Every kind of sexual contact in the Department of Corrections is considered volatile because there is no consent. No means no, and yes is not allowed. That's what the mantra is. That's what they tell you when you get there. No means no, and yes is not allowed. But even if there are assaults occurring, there's such a heightened level of fear of retaliation and being disappeared that they're not saying anything. They're afraid to even ask for the form to write the inmate complaint because they've seen assaults happen and get reported and nothing happen. And for the men to not have consequences, they either get shifted to another yard or, juggled between the two prisons. They see their friends get in relationships with these guys because they're not okay. They're not okay. There should never be a time where any woman incarcerated is put in a position to have to make these kind of decisions anyway. They're trying to rehabilitate, right? But this has been completely taken away from them. But I know that there's assaults happening, and just because one woman gets assaulted in a unit doesn't mean it's isolated. This impacts every single woman that lives in that whole building, on that whole yard, and the whole institution. It makes me sick. It makes my partner sick. We can't sleep. Like we're in a constant state of hypervigilance because we know this is what's happening. When there's a man who's given it to one of the girls, there's a window, there's a big giant window in the room. And as much as you don't want to look, you're going to see it in your peripheral and it's going to haunt you. And you're going to know no matter what happens, this is not, that there will be no consequences for this. It's horrific. And I mean, there's reports of it happening regularly. And there's even staff. There was a staff recently who was charged with like 22 counts of sexual misconduct at the same prison. So how do you depend on staff to protect you from the same thing that they're doing? You can't.
Mm-hmm. If you're just tuning in, we are talking today with Amy Ichikawa of the organization Woman to Woman and Joey Bright, who published an article yesterday about the Dana Rivers case.
Can people change? I believe they can. Something like this. I dealt a lot with batterers. There's a lot of sexual abuse in battering behavior because it's a power and control thing, much like sex offense. Much like a sex offense is a power and control thing. It has much more to do with having power over somebody than it does sex. Sex is a way to show that dominance. It's one of many ways. The physical violence that many men also exhibit with a sex offense.
Especially prisons, we're talking about people in a small environment. Caged in. In America, we had a woman in Hollywood. She called from an LA prison, from the inside, and talked about what it was like. And these men are in their cells with them. And American prisons are pretty tough anyway. You have to do, as a woman, if you have to go to court a lot or you're in isolation or whatever, you basically have to do they have to do cavity searches where there's like 50 women at a time and you have to pull yourself apart and you have to cough and all this stuff. So it's put a man into that. I mean, that it's degrading, humiliating, vile. And then on top of that, you've got a man who will then rape you as an inmate. And this particular girl thought because she'd annoyed one of the staff, that's why she got a man in her cell.
That's awful. Obvious.
Rebecca Warmbo is my guest. Rebecca, good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You've been in and out of prison for more than a decade, Rebecca, but since then you've become a published author. You've dedicated yourself to prison ministry and helping other women who are behind bars. But really in doing your good work, you've had to deal with now, I think, an almost unbelievable issue that's something I'm sure wasn't on your radar a few years ago, and that is men being housed inside Shakopee, Minnesota's only prison for women. What can you tell us about the situation there?
Well, first of all, they were considered transgender, but I'm not even saying that anymore because they're not. They're biological men. They have their male parts. They have every part that a male does. They aren't taking hormones. Once they get to women's prison, they stop taking hormones. They have beards and mustaches. They flash the women. They act like men. They catcall women. They talk about having $1 million baby. They collect semen in cups and are trying to get the younger women pregnant. And so I wouldn't consider them transgender people. I think they're biological men who are finding a way out of prison because they're pedophiles and murderers. And when you're a pedophile in men's prison, you get beat up. And so they found a way to get into a women's prison where it's easier. And as I have these emails where you talk about how it's like a kiddie camp and it's flowers and it's nice. And so they found a way out to get over there, and they get there and they just become predators. That's what every one of them has done, has been a predator since they've been in there. And when I'm talking to my friends, they're telling me this, and I was just in shock. I was like, I can't believe that there's men there. I looked it up, and sure enough, there is.
I want to get more into those emails here in just a moment, but a bit more on the backstory, the bigger picture in all of this. For one thing, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and his administration, they were behind the payments of nearly $500,000 to settle the Christina Lusk case. Lusk, a transgender woman, sued the Minnesota Department of Corrections for access to this so-called gender-affirming care a few years back now. The settlement, paid for by Minnesota taxpayers, also allowed Lusk to move to Shakopee, which, if we're being accurate, is now Minnesota's only prison for women and transgender women. But you've learned some of these men aren't necessarily even transgender through, as you're talking about this correspondence you've had with them. What can you share about that and share safely with us?
Well, first, Christina Lusk, now, that man, he had breasts, but he was on his Facebook page looking for women and talking as if he's a man. And when women sent me emails about him, he was a big guy. He was violent, aggressive, and talked like a man, acted like a man, and was a man. So they aren't transgender; they're biological men. But some of these emails I've gotten ones from Bradley Servo, who was he is in there. He's a murderer. And then there's a Nathan Johnson who's now released. He was the only person that was sent over there that doesn't have a pedophile crime or a murder crime. And then Elijah Berryman, who's a pedophile and has raped some little kids and did it violently, so bad that he actually got triple the amount of time that normal people would have gotten. And when I found out about this, I reached out to them because I thought, well, I'll try and talk to them and see what they have to say. So I sent some emails off to them, and I have some responses from them that are pretty shocking. Like I asked questions about, for Bradley, I just kind of asked him, how did you become transgender? What did you think? And he said to get into the prison, he had to talk to the transgender committee and request it and wait to get approved. No one said nothing to me about having to go. That was my choice because I feel like that would be more in touch with who I am. But he says I could have just done my time where I was at Rush City as well. It was just fine. He didn't think it was bad being in Rush City. As far as the screening, again, I just requested from the committee for transfer, but I went through some other stuff in the first years of coming out. So what he's referring to is he was when he hit 2 COs, which are staff, with a pool cue and ended up getting sent out of state to a federal prison, a supermax, for 6 years. This is a man who is deemed safe to be in with women. He was sent to a supermax prison for beating up 2 COs. Since then, he's been in and out of SAG, been in trouble. He says in his email, I have some anger issues after coming back from Florida. And he said he's been pretty good for the past 4 or 5 years only.
You've known some of the women in Shakopee for years, Rebecca. We recently reported about Jamie Ali, who I know you know very well. She told us about some truly repulsive things going on inside Shakopee, including, as you mentioned already, bottles of semen being stored inside a man's room with the hopes of getting a female inmate pregnant to then sue the prison system. Even J.K. Rowling, the famous author, took note and responded to our story on social media. She summed it up by saying, quote, "If what this woman describes doesn't constitute cruel and inhumane punishment, I don't know what does." So talk more about that. What dangers are women now facing because of all of this? What have you heard?
I think you also talked to Chaos that was on here too. They both filed reports on sexual harassment from Danielle, who's now out, and from these people, and filed reports to PREA, which is the sexual investigation place where they investigate sex crimes that happen in prison. When they asked for their paperwork back, the lieutenant told them they don't have the paperwork. So they're not giving them the paperwork, because when I looked it up on the DOC site, there is no reports at all of any harassment, sexual things going on through PREA, because the staff is not handing it through to PREA. And they do that because they don't want to be sued. They're trying to avoid lawsuits where they have their names and stuff written down. And Jamie's gone through a terrible time with this, with these men that they flash them. I mean, they'll sit in the room and they flash them, and they masturbate, with themselves in front of the women when they walk by. And it's just sick stuff that I'm shocked that we're even talking about this when we're talking about a women's prison, where when women go to prison, they should go there and you have to serve time because you've committed a crime, and that's sensible, right? But you shouldn't have to go there and be traumatized worse, harassed sexually, and feel in fear for your life at every second. These women have to shower down the same hall with these men. They don't have special hallways or locked. You can't lock a door, so they have to go in there and shower, knowing that the man could walk in there at any time. And some of the men will stand outside the shower and wait for them when they come out and say stuff to them. They collect semen in cups, and this has been going on with Elijah and that Sean. They were collecting semen in cups, and they were collecting them to put them in a cup and trying to give it to a younger girl so she could impregnate herself. Because in prison, they call it $1 million baby. And they're trying to get somebody to be pregnant so they can sue for $1 million. That's the whole plan. That's what this whole thing has been all about. It's all about money. They just want money, and they know that they're going to get it because people have been winning lawsuits, and they're going to get out, they're going to file lawsuits. They all talk about it. They're all planning on it, and they have lawyers and everything. And for Jamie, I feel she doesn't even go out of her room anymore. She sits in her room and doesn't come out of her room. She's afraid to come out because she was abused and raped before from men, and she's terrified to come out of her room. They talk about Minnesota's supposed to be big on rehabilitation, but how are you rehabilitating these women when they're stuck in these places with these men where they're terrified? It's not going to end up well. They're not going to get out of prison. They're not going to live a good life. They're going to have to deal with that trauma, and it's just going to cause chaos.
So whether sex offender or not, thinking in terms of the safety of women in prison, whether the guy is a convicted sex offender or not, your thoughts about the safety for the women of sending any guy into a female prison, a male inmate. Just to recap.
Here is something that had not come to my mind before. You are familiar with this process. For an inmate to be employed in a female-sensitive area of the institution, they have to basically have a background investigation. We research their file. If they have had any offenses or any behaviors that show a danger to females, they cannot be approved to work in a female-sensitive area of the institution. Why would we then allow an inmate who would not be approved to work in a with female staff members? Why would we then transfer them to an institution to be housed with female inmates? Why would we do that? And one thing that we did briefly discuss when you asked me about the possibility of doing this podcast, separations. For an inmate to be transferred within the prison system, and I I can only assume that other states follow a similar process. They look for separations. Is there a reason this inmate cannot be sent to a certain institution? Does he have a victim incarcerated at that institution? Does he have a person that he has gotten in trouble with incarcerated at that institution? Is there a staff member at that prison who he cannot be around? As staff members, we were encouraged to put a separation in if somebody that we knew, somebody who we were familiar with, was incarcerated. Somebody was convicted of a crime and might possibly come to the state prison system. We were required by policy to submit that information so that that person would not be sent to our institution. Now, what reason would there be for a male inmate to be separated from a female inmate? Historically, anyway. Would I even think to, working at a male institution, would I even think to notify my administration that a female that I knew had been convicted of a crime and might be coming upstate? If I'm not considering transferring my employment to a female institution, I would not do that. So why would a male inmate be separated from a female? A female inmate. I can't see any reason that would have been done. So how are these states that are looking at sending males to female institutions, how are they determining whether or not he may have a prior victim or current victim?
Especially since 24 out of the 50 states, half of the states, only have one female institution. So wherever a guy is going to transfer, wherever around that state, he's coming to that one location.
What do you think about that? Should biologically male prisoners, particularly those convicted of or with a history of sex offences, be held in jails, female jails, alongside vulnerable females?
Only if we're going to start putting foxes in the hen house. What a ridiculous idea. No, I don't. I genuinely don't think men that have raped women and children should be in women's prisons.
But it is happening. I mean, the point is that men who identify as women are being sent quite regularly now to female jails. Only recently, 12 convicted sex offenders, males identifying as women, were sent to Scottish female prisons. So it's happening all the time. And as Lord Blencathra said, the female prison estate is currently being run as a mixed-sex institution. And you know, Kelly J, that not that long ago, a couple of years back, somebody called Karen White, who identified as a female, was transferred to a female jail, promptly raped two of the inmates. But still, in the face of that, this continues. I mean, I don't want to be illiberal about people identifying as whatever they want to identify, but this strikes me as a form of madness.
Well, I think in all the conversations thus far, it doesn't seem like anyone said, hang on a minute, what about the women in the prison? Those women that they can't leave, they are literally prisoners. They can't leave, and they are often right next to men who are showering, revealing to those women whether or not they're in a state of excitement. And these women are really frightened. And in fact, what's also happening in prisons is if those women misgender, so if those women call those male rapists men, then they get punished. I mean, it's just absolutely startling and ludicrous.
Yeah, just to refer to what's happening in Scotland, it's 12 trans prisoners convicted of violence or sexual crimes have been accommodated in Scottish women's jails within the past 18 months. So, you know, as I said, I just think that's insane.
I think what happens with this sort of ideology and it being dogmatic and having no nuance, because if you question any part of the ideology that a man can be a woman, if we admit that those men that are going into women's prisons that have raped women, if we admit that they are men and they're not the same as other women, no matter what they call themselves or whether or not they've got a GRC, if we admit that, we have to admit that other men might not also be women. And so I think that's how we've got down this cul-de-sac. But the question, two questions have been raised for me. One of them is, what is the point of the single-sex exemptions in the 2010 Equality Act if it doesn't mean that we can keep all men out of women's prisons? You know, what on earth is the point of the 2010 Equality Act? And also, we now know that a GRC, so a gender recognition certificate, doesn't actually mean that a man is any less likely to commit the most horrendous violent crimes. And therefore, I don't believe a gender recognition certificate should ever buy a man any access to women's spaces. And I certainly don't agree, as you well know, with self-ID.
What female inmate is going to consider putting in a separation from a male inmate? Why would she even think about something like that? Historically. Nowadays, we all know that this is something that is happening. But seriously, that's dangerous.
Part of the problem is that a lot of this is happening because of a series of orders that the Biden administration issued over the course of the first 6 months of the administration, impacting Title IX, among other federal administrative laws. And it essentially says that throughout federal administrative law, the word sex has to be redefined to include the words gender identity. And that is a disaster for women and girls, including the women who are on the UPenn women's swimming team.
Yeah, well, it just eliminates women and girls as a meaningful category, like they don't exist anymore. So how can you undo this? I mean, let's be honest. You cover this stuff. I'm from Washington. Like you change something like that, no one ever changes it back, right?
Well, so there is currently a lawsuit pending that was filed by 20 states, and I'm proud to say that the U.S. chapter of the Women's Human Rights Campaign submitted a brief in that case arguing that redefining sex to include the nebulous, nonsensical concept of gender identity also constitutes sex discrimination. And so I'm very happy to be involved in that lawsuit. But I also just want to note that what I unpack in the book shows that this goes far beyond sports. So we're seeing, for example, and we've talked about this before too, states like California, Washington, and other states across the country are allowing convicted male rapists and murderers to be housed in women's prisons on the basis of their so-called gender identity. We're seeing the total invasion of women's spaces, prisons, bathrooms, locker rooms, changing rooms, and sports by men on the basis of their so-called female gender identity. And what I really want everyone to understand is that words like gender identity don't have any meaning. They really don't. I mean, they're defined variously, inconsistently, and vaguely in ways that don't make any sense. Every single human being is either a male person or a female person. Everything else is a lie.
Man, if you ever have an hour, I'd love to sit down and just hear what your life has been like since you started saying obvious truths like that on television. I think you paid a big cost, and would love to hear about it at some point. Anyway, in the meantime, thank you.
Well, if I could just make one plea.
Yeah.
Can I make one plea to your viewers? Okay. So I have one plea to make, which is this. As Tucker knows, I'm a registered Democrat. As he said in my introduction, I have made common cause with many Republicans who are fighting back against so-called gender identity ideology. One thing that has frustrated me is that across the political spectrum, people still seem to be of the view that the phrase transgender people, the phrase transgender athlete, the phrase transgender student, the phrase transgender prisoner has some sort of coherent meaning. It doesn't. And so my plea to your viewers in particular, I know that it's Republicans who are holding the line. I don't like it, but I know it's true. Republicans are holding the line on material reality. All of that goes out the window when you use a word like transgender. It
You're
just
totally
doesn't
right.
exist. And
It's
I'm
smart.
begging viewers to stop using it. Thank you
so
so much.
Smart. The language matters. Karadansky, thank you so much.
Transfer him into a women's institution, and what the hell do you think is going to happen?
Meaning it would traumatize them.
It would re-traumatize them. They would be they would be revisiting some of the things that they had suffered previously.
But under these new circumstances, the anxiety and the fear is paralyzing. Yeah. The messages that we're getting flooded with are so, you can feel how scared people, they're very scared. These are women, including myself, that have been victims of lifelong traumas, verbal, sexual, financial, all kinds of abuses. Some women are there because they've been trafficked, and it's inhumane to think that they're going to expect people to not comfortably, but do their time and maintain their mental health under these circumstances.
You've got some real risk for lawsuits there. I don't know how any state prison system could win that one.
Yeah, and a lot of risk for the safety of female inmates. Well, Ken, we can talk. Boy, we haven't even talked about kind of the life of an average male inmate. We'll do a separate podcast on that because that probably could be a good public service, just for the general public to understand what goes on in there. And for those that are family members, how best to support in one way or another inmates, how not to be taken in, as it were, or manipulated by inmates. There's a lot we can talk about, so we'll plan on doing this another time. But just to recap, so from your perspective, 24 years worth, and mine 11 plus on psych staff, and you were doing both. You covered the block, the housing unit, as far as case management for years, and then did specialized groups, including violence prevention and batterers group. So from your perspective then, this is a recap, when we're talking about states that are now sending men, intact men, as you call it, that's appropriate, that they're sending them into female institutions. Half of the states only have one. From your perspective, then, is there any justifiable reason, whether for the safety of the male inmate or safety of the female inmate, to have this as a practice or policy?
My opinion, I can't see any. We do risk assessments, or have done. I have done. You still do. We talk to clients about assessing risk before making a move, before making a decision. I think the departments might need to do that. What's the risk versus the benefit? There's a lot more risk than benefit, John.
And as you indicated, the women that are going to be subjected to this, the risk of increasing trauma and or re-traumatizing them is very, very real.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Ken Herdman, I appreciate you. I appreciate the time that we rode together during our time in the DOC, and I appreciate your expertise and your willingness to come on to the program.
Thank you, John.
You've been listening to Predator Watch, dedicated to shining the light of truth about the nature of the most sophisticated of sexual predators most likely to target places where victims are most easily accessed. For John Uhler and the entire team, thanks for listening.
Predator Watch has been sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. As a nonprofit organization, Survivor Support is dependent upon the generosity of people who believe in its mission of supporting survivors. Please consider becoming a monthly supporter of this important work.